What would it mean to see the world as an infant? To be inundated with any number of impressions that William James described as one great, blooming, buzzing confusion. A world without form and structure, a purely sensorial world, unmediated by representation and expectation. Such a world eludes us, for to think of a world before thinking requires thought, and thought imposes form and structure. Yet the world is in motion, as are our thoughts. Movement and change live alongside of form and structure, and in attending to the interstices between the two, we may fleetingly glimpse the world of the infant. Impressionist painters sought after that world to capture transitory experience, the vibrations of light and dark, interpenetrating and overlapping to the point that one cannot be sure where one object begins and another ends. Consider Claude Monet's series of oil paintings you've been viewing here, entitled Vue de la Tamise à Londres, the presentation of the Palace of Westminster, painted at different times in varying weather conditions, reveals shifting perspectives of light and dark, boundaries that sharpen and fade, to the point of barely distinguishing the palace from its surroundings. Upon contemplating these impressions of a world prior to knowledge, we also discover an architectural mind, one that sharpens edges, delineating differences and distinctions, that imbibes in the flux of color, contrast, and motion to produce a world of form and structure, the world we recognize as our own. In this video, we'll address how the brain transforms sensory impressions into the world we experience through concurrently analyzing distinct categories of information. The brain's ability to simultaneously analyze distinct categories of incoming sensory info is called parallel processing. When discussing the information processing approach, we considered a linear model moving from inputs to invisible cognitive processes to outputs. This serial processing portrays cognition as a series of linear sequential steps, whereby the earlier step is complete and then followed by the next step. Parallel processing, in contrast, portrays cognition as a series of simultaneous processes, each working on discrete kinds of information. As a footnote, another model called parallel distributed processing, or what is sometimes referred to as connectionism, also presents cognition as a series of simultaneous processes. However, in that model, the processes are not independent but provide constant feedback to each other. This is a model we'll discuss later on in this course. Let's see how parallel processing works for visual perception. We'll begin with a cluster of cells called the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, which is located in the thalamus. The LGN receives connections from the optic tract. And when we get an even closer look, we can see that the LGN is made of a series of striations categorized as belonging to the parvocellular layer or the magnocellular layer, each consisting of P cells and M cells respectively. We can begin to see the parallel processing model at work here, as each cell has unique responsibility for processing specific visual information. P cells specialize in processing color and discriminating fine detail. In contrast, M cells process information related to depth, motion, and the localization of objects, including their orientation and position in space. M cells are theorized to be underdeveloped in some reading disorders, what is called the Magnocellular Theory. Since they're involved in stabilizing a visual image to compensate for minute eye movements, helping to focus on a single object and blur the less relevant surrounding environment, dysfunction in these cells can lead to some deficits observed in processing individual letters, for example. But despite some research supporting this theory, it does remain a controversial explanation for reading disorders. So even at an early stage of vision, parallel processing is taking place. This continues when that information going to the LGN then moves on to the occipital cortex at the back of the brain. The occipital cortex is divided into several distinct functional areas. And we begin with area V1, which is in the primary visual cortex and is perhaps the most studied region of the brain's visual areas. V1 identifies what is important among all the visual inputs and uses this information to guide visual attention. The neurons in this region are specialized in detecting contrast in light and dark that allow for edge detection. Edge detection is important for identifying individual objects in our visual field. Moving on to the secondary visual cortex, area V2 receives direct connections from V1. V2 processes relatively more complex aspects of the visual field, helping to distinguish the figure from the background. It also plays a role in guiding attention to important information and helping form memories of visual objects and recognizing them. Next are visual areas V3 and V4. And here we begin to see another set of parallel processes take place. Area V3, especially the top or dorsal portion, appears to be involved in general motion processing, whereas area V4 continues the work of V1 and V2 by processing an increasingly complex set of features related to objects and is even more strongly involved in directing visual attention. V3 has direct connections to area V5, or what is more commonly called MT, which also receives direct connections from V1 and V2. Area MT processes the more complex dimensions of motion, such as direction and speed. And one particularly devastating condition thought to result from damage to this area is called Akinetopsia, or motion blindness. An individual with such a condition is described as experiencing the world like a series of still images, leading to difficulties in estimating the distance of moving vehicles or trouble predicting when a cup will be filled upon pouring water into it. One particular illusion, called the phi phenomenon, demonstrates how our brains process motion, using this information to identify individual objects, even when in fact those objects are separate, as can be seen here. However, individuals with akinetopsia are unlikely to undergo this illusion, experiencing the traveling light as a series of separate objects rather than as one object traveling in a circle. From here, we can see the divergence of two major visual pathways, each responsible for processing a distinct aspect of our visual fields. Together, these make up what are called the two streams model, which proposes two qualitatively different cognitive systems for processing sensory inputs. First, there is the what, or ventral pathway. This pathway carries visual information from the visual cortex to the temporal lobe. The what pathway is responsible for recognizing the objects we see, connecting the processed visual features of objects to our stored mental representations. Without this ability, the world would always seem unfamiliar, as we would not be able to recognize everyday objects as we ordinarily do. Keep in mind that this is not a problem with memory, but of connecting visual inputs to memory. So someone shown a key may not be able to identify it, but they know what a key is, and upon putting the key in their hand, they can recognize it. This condition of not being able to recognize something that you see is called agnosia, and we'll return to it when we discuss the topic of recognition. The second major pathway is the where or dorsal pathway. Here information travels from the occipital lobe to the parietal lobe. While it's called the where pathway, it could also be called the how pathway because it's responsible for recognizing where objects are in space as well as guiding our motor movements in how to interact with that object. Damage to this pathway can lead to several conditions. One, called hemispatial neglect, involves problems with spatial attention. We'll discuss this condition a little bit later when we talk about attention. Another condition that can occur is called apraxia. Someone with an apraxia has difficulties executing a sequence of voluntary motor movements that were previously learned. It may involve the loss of the ability to brush one's teeth, make coffee, or giving a thumbs up. This is not a problem with motor functioning specifically, as the ability to move remains intact. It's also not involving a problem with understanding what to do, as the person may be able to verbally report the necessary steps involved in some motor task. Rather, it's about coordinating the stored mental representation of a motor sequence with the motor region responsible for executing that task. Spatial information is often an essential component to this process, knowing where and how to move in space. The two-stream model places a modern spin on an ancient philosophical issue, the relationship between knowing and doing. Our understanding of the relationship between the two has major implications for education, psychotherapy, and ethics. The problem can be stated something like this: why do I sometimes do the things I know I'm not supposed to do? And why do I not do the things I know I'm supposed to do? One major ethical theory proposes that people act wrongly because they're ignorant of the good. Consequently, it's thought that teaching and education lead to a transformation of action. If only I could have a more accurate mental representation of the harm my actions cause, I would no longer perform those behaviors, at least the thinking goes. While that contains an element of truth in it, there are many difficulties as well. It assumes that knowledge intrinsically carries within itself the desire to act in accordance with it. This assumption is embedded in diversity and sensitivity workshop trainings, many of you are required to or will be required to attend at some point in your academic and professional careers. Unfortunately, such trainings misunderstand the nature of human motivation and personal transformation. And they don't understand that unconscious bias is not undone by conscious knowledge only. So, how is knowledge and action integrated? How does the mind integrate the separate but parallel processes involved in processing our worlds? In the next video, we'll discuss this issue, what is called the binding problem. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give a thumbs up and subscribe so you know when the next video is uploaded. I'll see you next time.